This is part 4 of a series where I go through the entire Talmud, starting with Book 1, Tractate Berachot. Make sure to watch the first 3 videos if you want the context up until this point. Chapter 4 begins with, as always, a Mishnah, now leaving off 3 chapters of discussion on the Shema on to the rest of prayers. The rabbis hold that the morning prayer can be said until noon. Rabbi Yehuda says until 4 hours. The rabbis say you can say the afternoon prayer until evening. Rabbi Yehuda says until Plag HaMincha, the midpoint of the afternoon. The evening prayer can be said all night, and the additional 4th prayer, Musaf, that's sometimes said, according to the rabbis, can be said all day, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, until 7 hours. The Gemara asks, we say we can pray a few hours into the day, but we implied earlier that you pray alongside Shema, which is done much earlier. So that's only if you're being extra strict and say Shema with the sunrise. You actually can say it a little bit later. In addition, we say you can pray until noon, but we say later that if you miss a prayer, you can do an additional second prayer with the next one. Well, yes, you just don't get rewarded for saying that prayer in its proper time. On this note, we said you can do a second prayer by the next one if you miss the previous, but if you miss the afternoon prayer, can you make that up by the evening prayer, as that's the next day. Day starts by night, according to Judaism, and as prayer is in place of temple sacrifices, you can't make those up the next day, so can you redo that here? So, it says that you're allowed to. Also, this isn't allowed if you intentionally miss a prayer. In addition, as Shabbos has special prayer, the same rules apply, and if you miss the afternoon Shabbos prayer, you can make it up the night after Shabbos ends with 2 weekday evening prayers, and add the portions of the Havdalah prayer into the first one. If you add it in the second prayer, then only that one counts. However, seemingly only saying Havdalah in the second one should be fine, because it says elsewhere that if you miss Havdalah in your Amidah, unlike many of the other editions, you don't need to re-say it, so seemingly it should be okay to miss it in the first time too, so that just ends up being an unresolved question. Anyways, the concept of prayer 3 times a day was either instituted by the 3 patriarchs, or it's done as a replacement to temple sacrifices. There are respective proofs for both of these. There's a verse by each patriarch which implies to the institution of a prayer, and there's a proof that the timing of when you can say prayers correlates with the timing of when the respective offerings were brought for each of them, even the evening prayer, which is the only one that can be said from a specified point up to the rest of the night, correlating to the evening sacrifice, which was burnt all night, and the timing of the additional Musaf prayer coincides with the timing of the additional sacrifice. Again, the same applies with each prayer. On that note of the timing of the prayers, the afternoon prayer is said, according to an opinion, until the midpoint of the afternoon, which could either be the time of Mincha Gedola, 6.5 hours into the day, or Mincha Katana, 9.5 hours into the day. We hold it's the second one. The final point on their institution is that they were instituted by the patriarchs, and the exact times were designated based on the sacrifices of the temple, so it's a bit of a mix of both those two. On the previous note, there's an opinion that the morning prayer can be said until the 4th hour of the day. So, is this including or excluding that 4th hour? The answer is pretty complicated. We said a number of sources of different times this opinion said until a certain point, whether it included the last hour or not, or if it's even possible, because there are some circumstances where that breaks a lot of the timing principles established, or contradicts his own opinion, or agrees with opinion that he actually says he disagrees with. Point is, it does include that last hour, and there are a number of sources that back this up. Some of which are things like other people agreeing, Mishnahs which cite the same opinion, or verses from the Torah which imply it's 4 hours total. We also try to bring a proof from the actions of another who did similar, but that proof is non-viable, as there were others who practiced like the opposite too. We then cite a story where a rabbi was praying the Shabbos prayer on the eve of Shabbos, and during the end of the Amidah, you take 3 steps back, but here he didn't, as his student was right behind him and he didn't want to disturb his praying. We learn from this that A, we can pray the Shabbos prayer at this time, B, that a student can pray behind a teacher of his, and C, that you can't pass before somebody praying, as it could distract them. Question: but we learn elsewhere that any form of disrespecting your teacher, be it greeting them improperly, rivaling them by building your own school near theirs, citing something in their name if you didn't directly hear it from them, or praying behind them, causes the divine presence to leave Israel? Well, yes, that is the case, and in the above story, that was an exception, As the person wasn't really a student, he was more of a colleague, so he could be more informal. This is seen in his story where he informally spoke to him about the laws of Shabbos, wherein he went into a bathhouse to perspire, which was allowed then, as it was prior to the institution that it's not allowed on Shabbos. On that note, it also mentions somebody that fumigated baskets with sulfur on Shabbos, but you can't really learn anything from that incident because that was an error. Well, what if you make a mistake and accidentally pray too early? Like if there's clouds and you think it's later, and then the clouds clear up and you realize you prayed the evening prayer too early. Do you redo it? Well, some say no, they already did it, while some say no, because we don't make a congregation redo stuff as it's too much of a burden. According to the opinion that you can say the evening Shabbos prayer early, you still say the Kiddush prayer over a cup of wine. Also, you would still say the Havdalah prayer after, also over a cup of wine. There's some disagreement about the source, but that's the idea. Now for discussion on the regular evening prayer. The actual quote says that it is not fixed to a specific hour. So, what does that mean exactly? Some say that just means you can say it whenever you want in the night. Some say that just means it's optional. It was, in fact, a massive debate whether the evening prayer is obligatory or not. There's a whole story cited where they were arguing about it originally, so it went and was brought before the study hall, and the Nasi, the prince of the time, Rabban Gamliel, said his opinion, and the person who disagreed didn't really want to say anything out of respect, but he was told to testify his opinion, and he stood, but he was not told to sit back down, so he had to stand there for a very long time, and people started getting upset, so they decided to replace Rabban Gamliel with a person named Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, an exceptionally talented 18-year-old who consulted with his wife and took the position. However, he was worried he wouldn't be respected because he was so young, so he prayed to God, and his hair turned white. Hence he famously said in a quote, "I am like 70 years old," because he wasn't actually 70, he just looked really old. First thing he did when he got to the school was announce that everybody could learn there, instead of being super selective like the prior guy. And either 400 or 700 new benches got added to the school. Seeing this, Rabban Gamliel, the prior guy, felt really bad and thought that it was his fault that so many hadn't learned Torah in his school because he was too selective. So he saw in a dream white jugs filled with ashes, which represented that the new students weren't actually learning very well. But as it turns out, that wasn't actually true. They were learning well. He was just shown that in a dream so he could feel better. Anyways, it was a great day. Every pending halachic legal ruling was decided at that point, and even Rabban Gamliel kept going to that school without a grudge. There is a specific incident mentioned where an Ammonite convert on that day came in and asked if he could marry a Jewish girl, so it was argued a whole bunch because normally Ammonite converts are one of the few that can't marry a Jew, but there could be an exception because his people have been scattered around a whole bunch. In the end, the marriage was made permissible. Anyways, one of the arguers in that case was Rabban Gamliel, so we see that he went back to the school without any issues. Anyways, Rabban Gamliel went to the house of the earlier guy that he had offended to ask for forgiveness, and saw that he was also a blacksmith, which he was surprised by. So the rabbi got upset that he didn't know what Torah scholars had to do to support themselves, so Rabban Gamliel asked for forgiveness in the name of his father, and the guy forgave him. So, because he was forgiven, he was reinstituted as the head of the school, but this time shared with Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who would give classes for 1 week, and then Rabban Gamliel for 3 weeks. Also, the one who asked the original question that started all of this was a Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a very famous sage who has a whole holiday around him, but that's for way later. Okay, back to prayer. There's the additional Musaf prayer we mentioned that's said sometimes, and it can be said all day. However, don't delay it, as then you're called negligent. There's argument if you have the afternoon prayer and the additional prayer in front of you, which one should you say? Some say you should say the afternoon prayer, as that's done more often. Some say the additional prayer, as you could run out of time for that soon. We end up saying to say the afternoon prayer first. The source for this is that a sage, Rabbi Zera, if he got tired learning, he would sit by the exit and stand up whenever a sage walked by so he could honor them. And he did this, got into a discussion with one sage who had just finished memorizing this exact piece that you say the afternoon prayer first. On the topic of the timing of the additional prayer, one says that if you delay it past the 7th hour of the day, based on a verse, God will get annoyed and bring destruction because you delayed the festivals. There's a similar thing said about people who delay the morning prayer. On that note, there's a story where one of the rabbis didn't come to that day's lecture because he was sick, so they asked why didn't he just eat something first and pray the additional prayer a bit earlier, whether you hold like you can eat before certain prayers. In the end, we say the rule in that regard is if the time for the afternoon prayer is reached, you can't eat anything before saying it. New Mishnah. One rabbi would say a little prayer as he entered a study hall, that nothing bad would happen to him while he's there, and a prayer when he left as thanks. The Gemara says the exact contents of these prayers. Not going to say the whole things here, because this isn't really something done anymore. Then the Gemara goes and lists a bunch of teachings from different rabbis. When Rabbi Eliezer was sick, he taught his students to properly educate their children so they get reward. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai got sick, he began to cry and explained it was due to fear of an eternal God and his judgment. Then he blessed his students to have a fear of a God akin to that of the fear of a moral king, the logic being that you don't do things wrong if you know a mortal king is watching, neither should you do something wrong when God is watching. Then, right before he passed away, he had his room prepared in regards to the laws of purity, and had a chair brought in for the king Chizkiah, who he said was coming to accompany him. Alright, new Mishnah. Rabban Gamliel says you say the full prayer of the 18 blessings, the Shemona Esrei, also called the Amida. Rabbi Yeshua says to just say an abridged version of that prayer. Rabbi Akiva says you do the full version or not, depending on if you're fluent in prayer. Rabbi Eliezer says if your prayer is fixed, it is not considered supplication. This will be explained soon, what that means exactly. Rabbi Yeshua says if you're in a dangerous place, you can do a listed abridged prayer. If you're riding on a donkey, you should dismount and pray. If you can't, you should look towards the temple. If you can't do that, think of the inner room of the temple. Do this also if you're on a ship or something. And now the Gemara. There are 18 blessings in the Amida, either to correspond to the 18 mentions of God's name in Tehillim Psalm 29, the 18 mentions of God's name in the Shema, or to correspond to the 18 of the vertebrae in your spine. Furthermore, there are certain points in prayer when you bow, either to the point where all your vertebrae protrude, or until a coin on the ground would be parallel to your heart. Some say you just need to bow your head as long as you're actually exerting yourself. There was actually a 19th blessing instituted later, which speaks negatively about heretics, so that either corresponds, depending on which your opinion was, to an additional reference to God on that psalm, or in Shema, the word one, which counts as a name, kind of, and of the spine, it's 19 technically if you include the lowest descending vertebrae. In fact, there's a story that after the 19th blessing was added, the next year they were praying and the guy forgot the blessing, so he stood there for a few hours and he wasn't removed because he didn't make a mistake. And we do suspect somebody is a heretic if they mess up the heretic blessing, which was this 19th one, but not this guy, because he was the one that had actually instituted this blessing in the first place. And we don't suspect that he became a heretic since then, because there's a tradition that a good person doesn't become wicked, specifically if he was initially righteous to begin with. Although, even this may not be strictly true, as one of the high priests of the time, Rabbi Yochanan, became a heretic. Still, point is, there's no issue of concerns of heresy by this guy, as he was the one who had instituted the prayer. Alternatively, he started the prayer, and although it did take him a while to continue, he did finish it properly, so again, not a cause for concern. We said there are 19 total blessings of the Amida, and on Shema there is a different Amida said with 7 blessings. These 7 correspond to the 7 voices of God referenced in Tehillim number 29. On Rosh Hashanah we say 9 blessings corresponding to the 9 mentions of God's name in Chana's prayer, as she's one of the people specifically remembered on Rosh Hashanah, along with Sarah and Rachel. On a fast day, we say 24 blessings in the Amida, corresponding to the 24 songs of Solomon when he brought the Ark of the Covenant into the temple, specifically then, as it's a day of asking for mercy, like a fast day. It then lists exactly what the abridged prayer version of the Amida is, along with which blessings are and are not said. There's an unresolved question as to whether we say the Havdalah blessing in the actual Amida. There's similar points arguing about other of the individual blessings, about the prayer for rain, the prayer about the new moon, and others. It goes on for a bit like this about the formatting and circumstances, but yeah, if you just open up any prayer book, you'll see the accepted standard format of the Amida prayer. We said earlier in the Mishnah that if your prayer is fixed, it's not supplication. What this means exactly is that if prayer is a burden for you, or if you say it just as words, or if you don't introduce something new depending on your opinion. That last one isn't really done, as it can cause confusion. Or, some say what this means is to pray at the time of the reddening of the sun, which either means right after sunrise or right before sunset. Others say don't do this, as it could mess up your timing and you could end up praying late on accident. Then it says that you should do the abridged prayer if you're in danger, and there are a bunch of variants of which of these to do. There's also a story where Eliyahu, the prophet, told a rabbi to say the traveler's prayer while traveling, along with other advice like not to get angry or drunk. In fact, this traveler's prayer listed is still said to this day if you're going on a long trip or on a flight or something. There are more specifics as to when to say this prayer, specifically if your journey is longer than a parsa, an old form of measurement. Some say to say it specifically while standing, others even while walking or sitting. This is seen in the story where some said this prayer and decided to stand even though they didn't have to. This has some more discussion on it about the difference between the short prayers. The Havinenu prayer has more requirements than the standard abridged prayer, specifically that the Havinenu prayer requires additional blessings said before and after, and it's also considered a valid substitute, and you don't need to re-pray when you get back. And it must be said while standing, all unlike the other abridged prayer. If you're riding a donkey, you should get off the donkey to pray. But some say you don't need to do this if you have nobody to hold onto the donkey. Others say you can stay on no matter what, so that way you can focus better during your prayer. You're meant to face towards the temple in Jerusalem when you pray, but if you're blind, you can just focus on God. Specifically, you should turn to Israel. If you're in Israel, turn to Jerusalem. If you're in Jerusalem, turn to the temple. If you're in the temple, turn to the Holy of Holies, the innermost part of the temple. If you're in there, focus on the ark. If you're right by the ark, focus on the cover. In general, just face towards that direction, whichever direction you are from it. Generally, that just means facing east. Some would have the custom to pray early and then say the Shema later when the time for that came around. This applied by all holidays and their unique customs. Still, though, it's preferable to say the Shema and then the Amidah together for reasons written in chapter 1. Some in those days would also have their prayers done at slightly delayed times because they had classes to teach, but yeah, that's the idea. New Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said that we only say the additional Musaf prayer if there are 10 men in the city. Some say this doesn't really matter as a factor. Rabbi Yehuda says similar, that you don't say the additional Musaf prayer if you pray by yourself while there are 10 men in the city. The Gemara then says the practical difference between the first and last opinions, which are very similar, is in a case where there's not a group of 10 in the city. The first opinion would hold you're exempt, while the later opinion would hold that you need to say the prayer there. This is backed up by some who say that they did like this. However, there were many who didn't hold like this and said you always had to say the additional prayer based on the fact that they prayed 2 times on certain days. This is attempted to be discredited because maybe they prayed twice because they didn't focus properly the first time, but that's invalid as it was a good testimony that this occurred. Side point, some sages would only pray where they studied, which was a topic referenced some chapters ago. Anyways, some said that the guy prayed twice because he forgot to say the prayer for the new moon the first time around, so it could be that you don't actually need to say the additional prayer in some circumstances. Other point, some hold you should wait a bit between prayers, so your mind will either be in a pleading or in a beseeching mode. This is sourced from some verses. Anyways, we end off by invalidating that last attempted disproof in regards to forgetting the new moon prayer, as we hold that no matter if it was by a full or a short month, if you missed the new moon prayer, you aren't required to redo your prayer. Therefore, the fact that this guy prayed twice must have been the additional prayer. Therefore, the additional prayer is required in those cases. And with that, that brings us to the end of chapter 4.